Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Purple Penny video. My name's Mark. I run the Purple Penny along with my wife Kathryn. We're in Mawson Lakes in South Australia. We've been here for 4 years this May. We've been having these videos on Mondays or Thursdays for the last few years now. We generally talk about the latest going ons in the world about coins and banknotes, and we also try to have a bit of a topic of the week. A little bit different this week because I'm here by myself. Kathryn has popped over to Canberra to visit the Mint. She's also seeing our daughters who live over there, so I hope she's having a good time. Well, I know she's having a good time. She visited the Mint yesterday. I believe she also visited today, and she sent through some really interesting pictures which we'll look at a little bit later, which teaches something about how coins used to be designed, and perhaps they still are designed in some places. So a few hellos. Hello Patrick, Matthew, Mike, John, Greg, Leanne, Gwen, Tony, Graham, Ian, Brett and Ogie. Thanks Ian. Yes, I've got my PCGS shirt on today. Last week was a good week. Every week this year has been busy so far. We haven't had a quiet week. Our young man Jared, who comes in on Saturdays and helps us out, is going to be with us on Wednesdays, Thursdays and Fridays for the rest of the year. So if you're in the shop on those days, then please do say hello to Jared. He's very keen on coins and a very smart guy, and he will no doubt be useful to us during the year. So please say hello to Jared the next time you come in if you haven't already met him on a Saturday. He won't be in on Saturdays, just during the week, but it's going to be terrific having an extra helper here around the shop. So in terms of buying, we bought a lot of mint product this week, a little bit of gold, nothing that I'm just struggling to think of what we bought. Nothing I can think of that is worthy of a show and tell. As always, do keep an eye on our website on Mondays and Tuesdays, because that's when we usually pop up anything particularly interesting for sale. Mike is asking, has she got the credit card? Yes, she certainly does, Mike. She certainly has the credit card. Hello, Philip. How are you? Right, we'll just jump into the news here. So Thursday of next week, we're going to see the, at last, long last, the Mint Mark sets and the baby sets. They're both, the Mint Mark sets are a month later than usual. The baby sets are 2 months later than usual. The prices have gone up on them, but they will be available here in the shop on Thursday, the 2nd of February. We're not going to take any more names for them, I don't think, but it's always worthy of an email. If you are interested in putting a hold on some of those, just send us through an email and we'll see what we can do. Hello, Daryl. Oh, Paul, hello. Oh, Kathryn has joined in. Hello, Kathryn. She's in Canberra City eating lunch, I believe. So thank you for joining in, Kathryn. Now, interesting items in the news this week. A British metal detector has found a really interesting error in a field, and normally if it was a modern coin or a modernish coin, I probably wouldn't bother talking about it, but I thought this was just really interesting because it gives you an insight into the history of coinage and the people who made it. So this gentleman, David Stuckey, found this innocuous little 1878 sixpence in a field in Cambridgeshire. And what makes it interesting is that the obverse legend there, instead of saying Britannia, it actually says dritania. So whoever has impressed the lettering onto that die has misspelt the Britannia and replaced a B with a D. Now, it's actually not that unusual for that to have happened in England up until sort of the 20th century. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, all the dies are, for a long time, were hand punched, so there was no master punch that had all the lettering and stuff on them that created the dies, so they were hand punched, and often the mint workers were illiterate, so they didn't necessarily know that they were making an error when they were putting the misspelling there. Now, what goes on to make this even more interesting is that all of these coins were made specifically for Cyprus. Cyprus had just been conquered by the English in the middle of the 1870s, and they created a batch of sixpences sent specifically to Cyprus to pay the Indian colonial soldiers who were stationed in Cyprus at the time. When the sixpences got over there, the spelling error was noticed, and of course, with great embarrassment, they were actually sent back to England and destroyed. Some of them, though, did enter circulation, and I find it absolutely mind-boggling that somehow one of them ended up in a field in Cambridgeshire and someone found it. So, really interesting coin there that looks back on British colonial history and the way that coins are made and how errors can easily happen. So that's a 1878 sixpence where Britannia is misspelt to Dritania. Interesting little error. If you have been watching these videos for a few months, you would have heard me talk a few times about Zimbabwe and the gold coins that they released. So Zimbabwe's having an inflation crisis. I know that here in Australia we're having a bit of an inflationary crisis, but they're having one that's several orders of magnitude worse than ours. I think their inflation at the moment is north of 200% per year. To try and combat their weak currency, the Zimbabwe Reserve Bank released gold coins that could be purchased with US dollars at 5% above spot price. The idea being that the government would gather up those US dollars and help to stabilise the economy and pull some of the US dollars out of the economy and make the Zimbabweans use their own currency. Now those coins will just pop up what they look like here. They're called Mosi Artania, which is actually the name for the Victoria waterfalls, which I believe is the tallest waterfalls in Africa, which means smoke which thunders. So those 1 ounce 22 carat coins have been selling now for about 6 months at 5% above the US dollar gold price, and they just hit over US $2,000 and US $2,000 in the last week. There are some smaller sizes of these coins. I believe there's a 10th ounce and a half ounce as well. There's also some international unit trusts that allow you to buy these coins in very small amounts, where you can just perhaps pay $10 and buy a fraction of one of these gold coins. So I still want to get my hands on one of these. I think that they're really interesting. Zimbabwe has a very coloured economic history, and some of their banknotes in particular are really interesting because of the number of zeros that they've got on them. The $100 trillion note being the most popular of those. So that's the Zimbabwean Mosi Artania 22 carat 1 ounce gold coin, just gone over US $2,000 this week. Now, if you're here in Australia, you probably know that the Australian Open is on in this week and next week, which is a tennis tournament in Melbourne, and for the last 5 years they have issued a so-called Australian Open coin, and I did cover this last year and said the same thing last year. They keep calling it the Australian Open coin, but it's not a coin, it's actually a medal. They've put a group of tennis celebrities on each of these medals that they release every year. This year it's Ken Rosewall, who's an Australian tennis player. I believe he was the youngest person to ever have won the Australian Open when he was 18. They've minted about 150 of these medals, and they're used for coin tosses at the starts of matches to, I assume, whoever serves first or gets to pick which end they're playing at. I'm not sure how it works with tennis. And these medals are given to tennis hotshot participants. Tennis Hotshots is a Tennis Australia program for young tennis players, and about 150 of those young people get one of these medals to take home after it's been used in a coin toss. So Tennis Australia, it's not a coin, it's a medal. There's a difference between a coin and a medal. They've done press releases all this week about this year's coin. It's not a coin, it's a medal. Right, so that's it for the news this week. Kathryn is in Canberra and has gone to the Mint and sent me some really great photos this morning. She was talking to me last night about them on the phone, and she was kind enough to send through some photos today to allow me to have something to talk about. I promise you this isn't a holiday slideshow, it's a bit better than that. So this is the first item here. It's a 1930 penny that's on display in the upstairs gallery area at the Mint. It's uncirculated. It's part of Australia's national coin collection. What's remarkable about the 1930 penny, this one in particular, is it's uncirculated. There's hardly any of those, and by hardly any I mean less than a handful. The 1930 penny is probably Australia's most famous coin, certainly the one that everyone knows. Even non-coin collectors know what the 1930 penny is. They were made on 2 days in 1930, just 2 days in 1930, and perhaps about somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 of them minted. I'm not sure how many are still extant today, but originally there was only about 1,000 or 1,200 minted. On the first day they made, I believe they made the proofs, and then on the second day, and they weren't consecutive days, they made the circulation examples. The circulation examples, I believe on that day they were trialling 2 pairs of dies, and the reason we know that, or at least 2 pairs of dies, is that of the 1,000 or so circulation strikes, just about all of them are struck with what's called the Indian obverse die. That means it's a die that was originally intended for use in India to strike pennies, and just a very few were struck with a London obverse die, which is ever so slightly different, and by a very few there are 4 known of that 1930 penny struck with the London obverse die. Interestingly, all the proofs are struck with the London obverse die. And you know, how difficult is it to find one of these coins? Well, you know, it's not really that difficult. You can go out and buy one pretty much any time you like. High-end coin dealers in the eastern states usually have some in stock. I'm not saying we're not a high-end dealer, but it's not really the sort of stuff that we deal in. So they're not difficult to find. They're always available through retail channels, and there's always some in bigger coin auctions. But you know, here in the shop in over 4 years, we've probably seen, I don't know, 300 fake 1930 pennies in 4 years, and 1 real one. And the real one didn't come in a collection. It came in the hands of another dealer who was trying to sell it to us. So they are not very often seen in the wild. It would be interesting to note how many exist, but you know, it would be great to go to the gallery at the Mint and see an uncirculated one that is on display there. Kathryn and I were lucky enough to see a proof one in the coin collection of the Art Gallery of South Australia several years ago. So yeah, that's Australia's probably most famous coin, the 1930 penny. Welcome Peter, welcome Sharon, hello Gloria, hello Darren, hello Ronalyn, hello Sandy. David is clarifying, in tennis the winner of the toss gets to pick whether they serve or receive and which end. The coin toss loser gets to pick the other one. The winner didn't select. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Hello, Donald, Jess, Bradley, Aaron. Right, so thank you everyone for joining in. Right, hello Phil as well. Other items that Kathryn sent through pictures of this week, and it was reminded me of an auction that we watched about a year ago. In the early 1990s, the Royal Australian Mint issued a Royal Ladies coin set. They issued it in silver and gold. The designs were created by Stuart Devlin, who is, you know, probably Australia's most famous coin designer. He designed all the original decimal coins, and they had portraits of 5 royal princesses on them: Sarah Ferguson, Princess Diana, Princess Anne, Queen Mother, who's not a princess, of course, and Princess Margaret, I believe. And those portraits of those royal ladies were created by Stuart Devlin based off of photographs that were taken of all of those royal women immediately before a meeting with the I believe, the ambassador of Iran. So they were all in their finest dress with their crowns and tiaras and ball gowns and all that sort of stuff. They all sat with Stuart Devlin for 30 minutes each as he took these photos. So what is really interesting is that Stuart Devlin's photos and the original plasters that he created off the basis of those photos were sold at a St John's auction late the year before last, I believe. I'm not exactly sure. It's well over a year ago anyway. So those are the original photos there and the plasters that Stuart Devlin had, and they were auctioned by St James Auctions. So basically those plasters are sculpted by hand by Stuart Devlin on the basis of the photographs that you can see above there. Now, Kathryn and I were lucky enough several years ago to go and visit Tony Dean, who is a coin designer for the Royal Australian Mint and the Perth Mint and various other places. And people really do sculpt these things by hand, this plaster by hand. So whoever won this auction has got a fabulous keepsake here of a bit of Australian coin history. But what was really interesting was that when Kathryn was in Canberra, someone is asking why is one the other way. Now, Sandy, I did actually look at that and I couldn't find a reason. It could just be simply that the person in question thought that one side of her face was better than the other one. It could be as simple as that. Peter says 1930 proof pennies are Indian obverse. Thanks, Peter. I got that wrong. So on display in the gallery at the Royal Australian Mint are these. These are the completed plasters of the gold coins that were in the Royal Ladies Gold coin set. So those designs there, the portraits there, are pretty much exactly the same as what we saw on those other plasters, but you'll notice they've been surrounded by additional design elements and also by the legends and things like that. So the coin designer, in this case Stuart Devlin, he would have sculpted the portraits first, and then on the basis of those plasters would have cast probably many copies of those plasters. And apparently having spoken to Tony Dean, the fineness of the dental casting plaster that they use to create these plasters is such that they lose very little detail. As they make different impressions, they lose very little detail or no detail at all. So either Mr. Devlin applied those additional elements by hand, or alternatively you can actually apply those additional elements by machine, and I'll explain that process a little bit later. So there's two of the completed plasters there that Kathryn took photos of. There's two more elements there that Kathryn took photos of, and these plasters are quite large. They're 20 or 30 centimeters across, perhaps even bigger than that. The ones that we've seen are bigger than that. So they are big things. They are big things, and this is how coins were designed, and in a lot of low volume environments probably still are designed this way. Now, Mike is asking, do they still do it by hand or by computer? Now, Mike, I suspect that these days in high volume environments that most of it is done by computer. You can store three-dimensional geometry in the computer and manipulate it a lot more easily than by hand, but I also suspect that the initial portraits still need to be created by hand before they can be scanned. And if you look at some of the Mint's designs, I think it's obvious which ones are based on purely computer design elements and which ones had the hand design elements in the process there somewhere. Now, it makes sense, I would have thought, to create the portraits by hand, the three-dimensional portraits by hand, and then add the legends and things like that by computer these days. In a little bit, we'll talk about how they used to apply the legends to the plasters, because they didn't necessarily do that by hand. They did use a mechanical aid to do that. So there's some more completed plasters, and then Kathryn sent through this picture here, which I think is really fantastic picture. We can see the completed dies there up the top, some struck coins, and then on the right hand side there is a picture that's up on the wall of the Mint, and it's an initial design concept of the Queen's mother Queen Mother's coin that Mr. Devlin submitted to the mint. Now, that wasn't the finalised design, it was just an idea that he had. Lovely, lovely, amazing keepsake, and it would be wonderful to have that in your collection, you would imagine. Right, now, how do they create how did they create the designs back then? So the thing is initially designed in plaster. Now, back in the day, the dies were actually cut by hand. So when you see ancient Greek coins that have high relief and beautiful sculptural elements, those dies are cut by hand. Someone has sat there and cut that die in tiny detail by hand. When we spoke to Tony Dean, who is a contract coin designer for various mints around the world, when he did his apprenticeship, he was actually taught to cut dies by hand, but he had changed to actually cutting the plasters, and he said he would make many different casts of the plasters to achieve different things. So he would perhaps sculpt the portrait in relief, and then he would cast it so it was, what's the opposite of relief? So it was incuse, and then he would add elements that way, and then he would create another casting of the plaster and do it multiple times. Now, what he did to apply the legends in his situation is that he used a reducing lathe, and you can see a picture of the reducing lathe there at the bottom. He would use a reducing lathe that had photo-etched copper templates in it, and the reducing lathe would follow those templates and then carve the letters and things like that into the plaster itself. Now, these days, you would imagine that the portrait would be carved by hand, sculpted by hand. It would be digitally input into the computer, and then computer-aided design software would be used to add those legends to the three-dimensional portraits and things like that. But back when things were done by hand, that wasn't how it happened. Now, when the designer was happy with the final plaster, so those plasters that Kathryn sent through with the lettering and design elements and things on it, they would cast a silicon mold from that plaster, and then they would fill the mold with epoxy. That would get you a hard casting of the actual design itself, and perhaps it was this big. And the next problem was how to get that design into a piece of metal that could be used to strike coins, and that's where this reducing lathe that you can see there comes into play again. Basically, the reducing lathe is a for want of a better word, it's an etch-a-sketch. If those of you who are old enough to remember what an etch-a-sketch is, where one end of the pantograph traces the design on the hard epoxy casting. You have differential lever arm lengths, and then there's a tool head on the other end of those differential lever arms, and that is actually cutting design into a piece of metal. And once that has passed perhaps several times to achieve the level of detail as required, you end up with what's called a master hub. That master hub is then used to press master dies, which are then used to create the coins themselves. So that's how it used to happen, and that's probably only changed in the last 15 years or so, and I suspect that for smaller medalists and things like that, some of this hand crafting still goes on, but I also think that the general quality of cheap medals and medallions that comes out of Asia, they are purely done on computer-aided design, and they look pretty terrible as a result. So this hand carving, I think we're still a long way from achieving that hand sculpting that is possible to be able to do that in CAD. So that's a little run through of the process of creating a coin design, prompted by Kathryn's photos of those plasters that can be found in the gallery at the Mint. So thank you, Kathryn, for sending through those photos. Right. Cameo and intaglio. Thank you, Eric. That's the term I was looking for. Right. Daryl says, very interesting. No worries. Sandy says, do they change the date section every year? Surely they wouldn't do the whole thing. Yeah, so they would change the date section, Sandy, and cut a new die. I suspect these days they probably cut the dies with a process on something other than a reducing lathe like this. So it's probably a computer-driven machining center, I would have thought, that would recut those dates. every year, but they wouldn't have to change the whole legends. Of course, recently when the memorial obverse was announced of Her Majesty, where they're going to squish the date on there, of course there isn't an unlimited amount of space to put those legends in there, so no doubt some coin designer sat there on their little computer workstation and manipulated those letters around to make everything fit nicely, and then they would have had to cut new dies on the basis of that digital data. Philip says he still has his Etch-a-Sketch. David is asking if the Purple Penny will be at the Melbourne Money Expo next week. We are not ANDA members, David, so we will not be there. And Jess says, no worries. No worries, Jess. I'm glad that you found that information interesting. That's it for this week. I'm sure we all wish Kathryn safe travels back to Adelaide when she gets back this week sometime. Thank you, everyone, for watching. If you've got anything... Daryl says, do you know if they are making a 2023 $1 Mob of Roos? No, I have no idea. As I said last week, mints around the world are really thrashing around with coins because of the new Charles portrait that's required. The Canadian Mint has given up altogether. They're not releasing any 2023 dated coins. It doesn't mean they're not minting any coins. It just means they're not releasing any. They'll all be 2022s, no doubt, and I suspect our mint will do that for the majority of the year. So, all right, that's it. Bye for now. Safe and happy collecting, everyone, and we'll be back next week.